First, I would just like to thank Roger for inviting me to talk about Arendt, to talk with my fellow panelists, and to present some ideas to you. And I should say at the onset that I am not an Arendt scholar, and Professor Berkowitz indicated that he thought that that was a distinct virtue of this panel, that we are not Arendt scholars, although I have my questions about whether that's actually true. And also, yes. And also I should. What's that? And also I should indicate that I did not prepare remarks, and so I just want to raise a few questions about the banality of evil, the thesis, Arendt's work, and how to situate her contribution to thinking about evil. I should say at the onset that I'm not actually quite sure why this formulation, the banality of evil, proved as controversial as it was. And we got from Roger a few chapters kind of reflecting on this question, the controversy that emerged in response to this work, and I think when situated in an account of the sort of increasing bureaucratization of modern life, instrumental rationality, so forth, a sort of post-Weberian tradition of thinking. This is not altogether a surprising thesis, and in light of the work on totalitarianism, we're living it. We're going to live it right now. Brilliant.
Women in darkness.
Brilliant. Anyway, so it is true that I'm actually not sure why that this phrase generated the kind of controversy that it did in light of her earlier work on totalitarianism. And of course, it's in the earlier work on totalitarianism that Arendt sort of mobilizes a notion of radical evil, and this seems to be in some ways a revision of it, although given her account of totalitarianism, this seems in many ways a sort of continuation of that work. So I actually just have questions as opposed to sort of polemics to offer today. One is that I had the first sort of line of questioning. I had the pleasure of, as I was preparing some notes for my visit here, I had the pleasure of teaching in my seminar at Williams Kant's Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, which is, of course, where Kant gives us the most extensive account of what he calls innate radical evil, right? And in a lot of the commentary on Arendt, Arendt's concept of the banality of evil is contrasted to the sort of Kantian notion of radical evil, right? And what is her kind of attitude and positioning vis-a-vis Kant's concept of radical evil? Is Kant's concept kind of operative in her earlier work, and then she comes to abandon it, so forth. One of my questions is whether or not Arendt and Kant are even talking about remotely the same thing. And so how productive is this kind of coupling, this inquiry into Arendt's relationship with Kant? Now, in addition to not being an Arendt scholar, I'm also not a Kant scholar. You're really wondering why I'm here. Apparently a scholar of next to nothing. But it seems that that when Kant talks about the concept of innate radical evil, he is concerned to get at a certain paradox in moral freedom. Right? The fact is, for Kant, that we have a categorical, that we sort of posit the moral law, we have a categorical imperative, we know what we ought to do, we give ourselves that law, right? So we are the authors of the law that we give ourselves, right? The sort of Rousseauian notion of freedom that we find in Kant. And yet he wants to say that nevertheless we fail in various ways, and we have evidence of this in the world around us, we fail in various ways to kind of live up to the ethical standards and imperatives that we have given to ourselves, right? And it's this is actually, I think, for Kant, an ontological paradox. less than a kind posture of political judgment, right? How is it that we have something like the categorical imperative on the one hand, and yet continue to bear witness to what we would call evil, criminality, depravity in the world? And as Kant is detailing what he calls the predisposition to evil, and then he will kind of develop as innate radical evil, he distinguishes three modalities of evil, right? So he's not even kind of talking about evil in the sense of depravity, right? He's talking instead, I would argue, about a certain kind of paradox in the condition, the sort of ontological condition of freedom. And I'm not sure that that's what Arendt is talking about at all. And so therefore I have questions about how productive it is to put a Kantian concept of radical evil alongside an Arendtian notion of the banality of evil and try to figure out how they relate to one another. Now, I appreciate that one of the things she wants to do is give us what Richard Bernstein describes as an anti-essentialist account of evil. And I would argue, and I think in this way contra Bernstein, that this anti-essentialist account of evil is her most profound anti-Kantian move. Insofar as she wants to distinguish between kind of depth and surface, and she wants to insist that evil doesn't that evil sort of circulates on the surface of things and doesn't penetrate to the depths of things, and I actually think quite different from Kant in that respect. So one question I have is just about sort of orders of evil, what this term means, how this term is mobilized, and whether or not evil comes to mean different things in theorists philosophers who are nevertheless in dialogue with one another. So that would be one line of questioning. The second line of questioning I have about Arendt's notion of radical evil concerns her distinction between the doer and the deed. Now, as we know, and as several panelists have discussed, part of Arendt's ambition in this text is to indicate the extent to which Eichmann's deeds are monstrous, but Eichmann himself is no monster, right? He's terrifyingly normal. Right? That's precisely what is so frightening about the figure of Eichmann. Now, it's important to note, I think, that in distinguishing the doer from the deed, Arendt is not gesturing toward what we would now call the death of the subject, right? There is still, it seems, some doer, right, even though the doer can't be reduced to the deed. And so I guess I want to know where this doer comes from, right? Who is this doer? How do we know that Eichmann is terrifyingly normal, right? What is it? Is she kind of positing some essence to Eichmann? And on what grounds is she positing this sort of essence of Eichmann that is terrifyingly normal? And I ask this question with the sort of presumption that Arendt is not giving us the death of the subject, in which there is no doer behind the deed. Although perhaps somebody wants to argue quite the contrary, that in distinguishing the doer from the deed, Arendt is anticipating what we would now regard as a kind of problematization of the doer itself as a philosophical category. Third sort of question or point concerns the relationship between moral capacity and politics, and Arendt's sort of anxiety about responsibility throughout this text. Right? She clearly wants Eichmann to be held responsible, and yet she knows, given her analysis of Eichmann, her distinction between depth and surface, doer and deed, and so forth, that holding Eichmann responsible is going to require some delicate footwork. I guess I don't share with her the anxiety about responsibility, and I know that this is a fairly sort of conventional problem in political philosophy. How are we going to hold subjects accountable for their actions? If we don't posit that they are agentic authors of their actions, can we hold them responsible? These kinds of debates, I think, are old and familiar and so forth, and I don't share this anxiety that Arendt has. For me, it's kind of not a philosophical problem to hold Eichmann accountable, even if he doesn't conform to kind of agentic, willful sort of action in some conventional sense of the term. But furthermore, I guess what I really want to press at is the extent to which the task of political analysis is one that we should regard as in terms of moral judgment. And I'm not sure, in part because I believe that there is a distinction between politics and morals, and from this I take my cues from Kant. And I wonder what it would mean to reduce political analysis to moral judgment, what we lose, what we can no longer see about politics, when questions of politics become questions of moral responsibility and moral judgment. And so I guess I want to kind of pry politics and morals apart from each other a little bit, so as to avoid what Kant would describe as political moralism, right? Arendt describes the banality of evil as word and thought defying, and much of our focus has been on the thoughtlessness of Eichmann. And so one thing to think about is Eichmann's wordlessness and the role of language in her account of evil, right? We know language to be essential to her construction of politics, right? Her theoretical construction of the political. And so how is language operative here? It strikes me not just thoughtlessness, but the fact that Eichmann was drawing from the sort of cliched language of funeral oratory without quite realizing that it was his own funeral, and that there's something about sort of wordlessness that captures the problem that she's trying to address. Finally, my last remark is a note on style and genre. So there is a virtual industry of Arendt scholarship in political theory, right? As I was talking to a friend in preparation for my visit, he said that we should have, at all liberal arts colleges, particularly where political theory is still valued as a vocation, we should have a discipline called Arendtology, right? Because of the industry around her. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for this, some good and some perhaps symptomatic of the state of contemporary political theory. One thing to note, though, is that despite the admiration that many contemporary political theorists have for Arendt, particularly those who are trying to kind of find alternatives to sort of liberal political discourse, right? And Arendt has been extraordinarily useful for those political theorists. Despite the sort of pedestal that she has been put on in her reception in contemporary political theory, we tend not to write these kinds of books, right? These kinds of books are not particularly valued, I think, in the scholarly circles in which I think all of us travel. There have been some efforts to develop kind of opportunities for that kind of work. But for the most part, contemporary political theorists decide to write on Arendt as opposed to sort of imitate something of her style. And so another question that I have is, why is that? And why have we opted for extensive exegesis over sort of the mimetic arts, right, in this case? And then I'll stop there.